All right. Hey everyone. Welcome back to my stream. Today we'll be continuing with learning React.js series and yeah, I'm excited. Let's begin. So, yesterday was a short one. Yeah, I think I covered only about 20 minutes or something. We'll know as we resume the video. Most of it was set up anyways. But what we've been able to do is that we've been able to set our first ever React app. Yeah, and I learned a couple of stuff too. So excited as ever for today. So let's begin. So before I start the video, let me start with the or you know run the development server. So I believe the command for that is npm run dev. And if I open up this localhost link, there you go. You can see my currently empty React app. Okay. So let's see where we have to continue from.
So what we're going to do is I'm going to remove this div hello world. And you can actually think of it like this. This div right over here is in fact our own component. It just renders the text hello world. Okay. And the hello world text is actually its own child component. But I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And we're going to go ahead and create a new file. We're going to something of this. And I didn't JS use the text file or I'm going to import allows me app. I'm importing it as a default import as well. Okay, so just like this. So no curly braces in this situation. Now what I'm going to do is in between this react.strict mode how it gets to actually render child code. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to
How does Docker help with production quality applications? And how do you build your own Docker?
Closing, we're going to do that right into app, but we don't have a child component that we're going to pass into app. At least we're not going to do that right now for this component. So what we're going to do instead of using the long syntax is we're going to shorten it by doing this. So angle bracket, app, and then closing it like this. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead into my browser, and you'll see now it renders this h1 tag into the document. And if I open up the browser tools by just hitting Control-Shift-I or just right-click and then just click on Inspect or View Page Source, actually not View Page Source, sorry, just click on Inspect, and then you'll see that right over here in the body tag right over here, I see my root div with the ID of main because we changed it earlier. You know, let me actually change that back before I forget. Let me change this back over here to roots and then go over to index.html and change this to roots just to be consistent. But again, if I expand, you'll see that I have this div, and this div is right over here. This is the root div of my app component, and this div holds my h1 tag that says root component right over here. So there you go. That is your very first component in React. Now, obviously, we're going to see a bunch of other examples, but this is our root component. The app component is our root components. So I'll go ahead and show you some more examples with components. I'll actually create a new folder called components, and I'll place all of my component files in this components folder. So what I'm going to do is now I'll create a new file, and think about the component that you want to create. You don't have to copy the exact component that I'm going to create. You can be creative and try doing it on your own as well. But think of any component you want to create. So I want to create a component that represents a user profile. So I'm going to call this component user profile. And I'm going to use Pascal casing. So the first letter of each word is going to be capital, or capitalized. So user, the letter U is going to be capitalized, and profile, the letter P is going to be capitalized, and then end it with .jsx. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create my user profile component. So remember, every single component needs to, one, be a function, and two, return JSX. I'm going to keep repeating this throughout the entire part of this tutorial, so that way it is ingrained in all of your heads. So we need a function. So we'll use the function keyword, and typically you want to name your function based off of the component. And in my situation, I'm going to actually name it off of the file name so they all match. And this is common convention. So user profile is going to be the name of this function, which is also going to be.
Yeah, I think I mentioned yesterday, I believe this would be the convention that you use the same name as your JSX file name
The name of my file
to
and
name
the
your
name of my
function.
component. And then remember that we also need to return JSX, so return. And you can use a div. You can also not just only use a div, but you can use literally any HTML tag you want. You can use a section if you want to. You can literally even use navbar, or not navbar, nav, if you want to. This is for navigation. But let's stick to div for now. And let's make sure we export this function. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to export this as a named export, because sometimes you might want to have other exports in this user profile file. It doesn't just necessarily have to be one single component that you might export. We only did a default export for app.jsx was because this is the root component, and there's going to be no other components out of here. But you can do this as a default export if you really want to, but I'm just going to leave it as a named export just to show you different patterns and different use cases. So again, we have our div. This is going to hold all of our content for our user profile. And I'm just going to go ahead and use literally any HTML element that I want. So I can use a paragraph tag, and I'll just do username, Bob. And let's see, let's do another div. And let's do span tag. Let's do email. And I'll use another span tag. And then we'll do ansonthedev.com, just showing you some simple examples, right? And let's see, what else can we do? I can do something like, I can use a section. I can even use an unordered list. And let's just do something like this. Let's do, let's see, favorite food. And then let's do a break. And let's do sushi. And I'll duplicate this a couple more times. We'll do pizza and Mediterranean food. Hopefully I spelled that right. Okay, now that we've created our component and returned JSX, and remember this is all HTML, but we're going to call it JSX. We're going to go ahead and now render our user profile component inside the app component, because remember, your app component. We're going to go ahead and now render our user profile component inside the app component, because remember, your app component is the root component.
Like pizza, I haven't eaten sushi, so I can't comment on that. Then what else do I like? Yeah, we'll add burgers in there, and then
Going to go ahead and now render our user profile component inside the app component, because remember, your app component is the root component. Everything is going to belong to this app component. Okay, when we get into routing and navigating users or navigating ourselves between different parts of the application, you're going to see that it's actually going to be inside the root application itself. So let's go into inside this div. So right underneath on line 5, I'm going to go ahead and first let me import my component. So import, and I'm going to use curly braces because I'm importing this as a named import. So user profile, and this is going to come from the components folder and then the user profile file. And then we're going to use angle brackets to render our user profile just like this. And now if I go into the DOM or the browser, you'll see that my component is being rendered. And if I look at the dev tools, I can see that this is the div. You know what? Let me actually go into user profile. Let me give this div an ID. So that way we can easily detect it in the browser tools. So you'll see that right now over here, this div is in fact the user profile component. And then we have all the other HTML right over here. Okay, so really what actually happens is we are writing JSX, we're writing our code inside our file just like this. And now if I go into the DOM or the browser, render.
What was okay? I lost my train of thought there. I believe I was gonna comment on something, but yeah, it's not in my head right now. So let's go to app.jsx and import the file to or the JSX function. Not JSX function, the component should use more React verbiage from now on. Since this is not a default, like it's not a default export, I believe I have to use the curly braces.
Our user profile just like this. And now if I go into the DOM or the browser, you'll see that my component is being rendered. And if I look at the dev tools, I can see that this is the div. You know what? Let me actually go into user profile. Let me give this div an ID. So that way we can easily detect it in the browser tools. So you'll see that right now over here, this div is in fact the user profile component. And then we have all the other HTML right over here. Okay, so really what actually happens is we are, and then we have
There we go. And if we go to our app over here, we'll have our root component, which has our user profile component. Actually, yeah, I mean, would this be called a component? I guess this would be our app, and the app would have components in it. Or this would be a root component, and this would, I mean, this would be a root component, and this would be our other components. Anyway, so we have, there we go. We have our user profile component inside our root component, which would be, yeah. Ah, All right, let's move on.
all the other HTML right over here. Okay, so really what actually happens is we are writing JSX, we're writing our code inside our JSX file, and then when we actually render our component, React takes care of generating all of this from JSX into actual real HTML and renders it into the actual virtual DOM itself. Okay, and this is again known as client-side rendering. So hopefully all of this makes sense. I do want to show you another way just to create components. It's not the actual way that you're going to create components when you're writing your React application, but I did want to show it to you regardless. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, and what I'll do is I'll create a component, and I'll call this, let's do user favorite foods. And we're actually going to show you two things at once. So this is going to be a user favorite foods component, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to
Okay, let's
abstract
leave
this
the
part of
same.
user profile. So I'm going to take this section that
user.
had this unordered list, and I'm going to move it into its own component. And again, this is something that you're going to do often in React. You're going to take components and put them into other components, so that way it makes.
Oh, hey, Chicken. How are you? Yeah, we are sure conversing. I mean, is that a made up thing or is it actually a thing? Yeah, going on with the React course, I guess.
Makes it a lot more easier for you to manage individual components. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and import a function from React. And that function is going to be called create element. And this is actually the old way of creating components in React.
Mhm.
We don't actually do this anymore, but
I thought so.
underneath the hood, React actually uses these functions to create the actual elements that gets rendered to the virtual DOM. So I'm going to use this create element function, and I'm going to give the name of the function user favorite foods, and then I'm going to simply just first let me export this function, and then I'm going to return, and then I'm going to not return.
Yeah, it's going good so far. I mean, to be frank, I haven't even covered 1 hour part of it, but so far I'm enjoying it.
JSX, but I'm going to return the function call of create element, just like this. Now, create element will take a couple arguments. So the first argument is going to be the type. So this is going to be the type of element, the type of HTML element that you want to actually create. So we're going to use div. So we're going to do div. You can use literally anything you want. You can use section. You can use div, whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, is React the? I don't know. I have to check these stats, but is React the most popular framework for web development or something? Why is not? I guess it is, or at least based on this. I don't know if this is even a reliable source, but at least based on it, it is. Next is same as React, right? It's built on top of React. Yeah, it is. Sure is. So far, I as you might know already, I come from Python, right? At least from a Python background. So if I had to make a browser, sorry, not a browser. What am I saying? If I had to make a website, I would go with Flask or maybe even Django.
You want. And then the second argument is optional. You can see that in the IntelliSense, it's telling you this second argument is known as props. We're not going to talk about props right now, but we will get to that in just a bit. We're going to leave this as empty. So you can either just pass in an empty object, you can do null, you can do undefined, whatever, it doesn't really matter. We'll just put an empty object for now. Oh, actually, no, I'll do null. And then the third argument and every other argument afterwards, because this is actually all spread out, because
Which is correct for backend. What do you mean by that? Are you asking which is the most popular backend framework?
see over here that you can actually pass in an indefinite amount of arguments after the second argument. So the third argument and every other argument afterwards is going to be children of this div element that you're.
Oh, okay. I got you. You're saying that is uh Flask is very correct for backend development. Yeah, it is, right? Yeah. But I mean, if I have to see, like, I can't find any similarities as of now. I guess it is similar in a way, but yeah, we have to see.
You're creating. So what that means is right over here, what I can do.
I guess as I go through the course, I'll be able to comment on what I like more.
Is I can literally just pass in any valid JSX. So for example, if I want to pass in a div and say user favorite foods, and if I save this, and now what I'm going to do is let me just, before deleting the section.
What's that? What is stats for front end frameworks? Is it the same thing that I pulled up? Maybe it's different. Oh, yeah, it's different. All right. Oh, so this is React, which is at 82%. Okay. Oh, where is doesn't this have next in it for some reason? That's weird. For 2024, okay. Cool. Alright, let's go back.
Let me go ahead and render user favorite foods. So I'm going to import that inside my user profile. And now you can see how we are building our hierarchy. So I'm going to import that, and then right down over here, I'm going to render user favorite foods, just like this. Okay, and then if I go into my browser, you're going to see user favorite foods. That text that is inside this div element, and this div element is inside this div element as well, is being rendered. If I go over here, you see we have this div, which is this div, and then we have this inner div over here, which is the child of our parent div. Hopefully that makes sense. I know that kind of sounds a little
So what is this create
how we are
element?
building our hierarchy. So I'm going to import that, and then right down over here, I'm going to render user favorite foods, just like this. See how user favorite foods. And if I save this, and now what I'm going to do is let me pass in a div right here argument, because you can see over here. And then null, you can do talk about props ran. The second argument is optional. You can see that in the IntelliSense, it's telling you this second argument is known as props. We're not going to talk about props right now, but we will get to that in just a bit. We're going to leave this as empty. So you can either just pass in an empty object, you can do null, you can do undefined, whatever, it doesn't really matter. We'll just put an empty object for now. Oh, actually, no, I'll do null. And then the third argument and every other argument afterwards, because this is actually all spread out.
I see the child. Yeah, the child elements for the div element here. So this create element creates the JSX for you. Yeah, that's what I thought too. Like, no, I agree with you. Like, React would kind of be the fundamental as such, right? Like, I was looking into Next, which is apparently, I believe, it's built on top of React. So, if I want to learn Next, I need to learn React. And I would assume, I don't know, but I would assume that other frameworks would have taken inspiration from React. Like, it would be pretty similar except for syntax. So, something like that. I agree
Over
with you.
here, that you can actually pass in an indefinite amount of arguments after the second argument. So the third argument.
So user favorite foods. Let's okay, we already created it, and we are gonna import this function. So we need to tell it what the parent element is. It's gonna be a div tag. We're gonna skip props, and we're gonna have child elements afterwards.
Afterwards is going to be children of this div element that you're creating. So what that means is,
yeah, exactly.
right over here, what I can do is I can literally just pass in any valid JSX. So for example, if I wanted to pass in a div and say user favorite foods, and if I save this, and now what I'm going to do is let me just, before deleting the section, let me go ahead and render user favorite foods. So I'm going to import that inside my user profile. And now you can see how we are building our hierarchy. So I'm going to import that, and then right down over here, I'm going to render user favorite foods, just like this. Okay, and then if I go into my browser, you're going to see user favorite foods, that text that is inside this div element.
Let's just import it and check it out for ourselves. So I'll import it here. And we'll use the shorthand. For some reason, oh, never mind. I thought it wasn't auto completing it, but it was. We can use this, can't we? The shorthand you showed me yesterday. But yeah, let's see. Refresh and okay. Let's see what this is about. We have our user profile, and then we have our second component, which is our user favorite food component. We open it up, and we have child element again. And what if we have another one? I believe it would go Let's just try this out. Let's call it second. And yeah, there we go, as expected. And what if I have if in my app.jsx, let's remove this and have, and let's have another development inside this. Say hi, and that is, maybe it hasn't reloaded it. Hello. Huh. And you have, I thought you could, right? I know adding space isn't gonna do anything, but this. Am I using this the correct way? Okay, user favorite foods is loading. Let's change the. Hmm. Maybe I can't or something. We will check later. I'll just follow the course right now.
And this div element is inside this div element as well, is being rendered. If I go over here, you see we have this div, which is this div, and then we have this inner div over here, which is the child of our parent div. Hopefully that makes sense. I know that kind of sounds a little bit confusing, but let me do this now. What I'll do is I'll take this entire section, I'm gonna copy it.
What's that? Use it because it makes things less declarative, but it's nice to. Ah, I see. It's yeah, it's one of those inner functions, right? Wait a second. The JSX command is translated into a JavaScript object inside the create element function. So basically, now a normal. Let's take this. Um, uh, Basically under the hood, a JSX component is translated into a JavaScript object. Did you mean the other way around? Like a JavaScript object is converted into a JSX component?
And I'm going to just paste
Yeah,
it
I understand what you mean. Basically, create element is the function which runs inside whenever we try to create components, right?
literally right over here. And now you're gonna see if I refresh, you're gonna see that, so inside the user profile component, so this div right over here, you can see that I have this div, which is this user favorite foods component. And then in that component, it has this section as a child component or child element, and it has our unordered list right over here. Okay, so visually it looks all the same, but from code-wise, from the developer's perspective, it's actually different. Okay, but to the user itself, they're not going to notice any difference at all. And one thing that I will do is actually, I don't even need this div. I can actually just change this to section, and I can remove this section over here. Okay, and now what we can do.
Wait, did you? Oh, I think he copied the favorite foods from user profile.
Instead, we just change this to section, and I can remove this section over here. Okay, and now what we can do instead is we can actually just put some commas right over here at the end of the span, at the end of the BR, the break tag, and then we don't need to do it for these list items because it's all encapsulated in this unordered list. But now if I BR, the break tag, and then we don't need to do it for these list items because it's all.
Yeah, we remove the section because that will be created here. Remove it from here. Add a space between the BR tag and the span tag, and we should be good to go. I guess I have to I didn't save this perhaps. Anyhow, so we have separated our user profile component and our user favorite food component. Oh, what's that? It's like when we create elements in AngularJS, add properties to it. Yeah. Okay, okay. I see. Like we could basically create a tag in, like we can even take any of these tags and then change its properties, but we don't do so. That's similar to that. I gotcha. In the old version, when React was using classes for components instead of functions, it looked scary to work with. Oh, it did. It used. I would assume because you have to append like um each property, right? Like equals this, equals this, equals this for each and every component. Yeah, I would assume that this would be. Not assume. I know that it would. This would be much simpler than that. That's good to
encapsulated in this
know.
unordered list. But now if
I
I
guess it's a bit of React low.
refresh, and I want to show you this because this is very important, you're gonna see
When was React released actually? Is it React which was created by I mean Meta? I was gonna say Facebook, but they've changed the name, haven't they? When was React released? 2013. It's been what, 12 years? Yeah, it's yeah, pretty much. Um, uh-huh. Jordan Walk. All right, okay. Let's go back.
that all of these elements, so this span, this break, and this unordered list, they are all part of the section. Okay, so literally any element you want to pass in as an additional argument is just going to be an additional element that will be appended to this section. Okay, so really what happens is it just adds the element to this section node right over here. Okay, as a child node. So that's why when you actually hover over here, it shows you that this children argument over here is actually an array of React nodes or React elements, and you can pass an indefinite amount, and they'll just all basically be appended to this section element or whatever element it is right here. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, and you'll notice that if I actually just take this whole thing and if I put this in a div, and if I remove the commas, all of these elements now will actually just go inside this div. So they'll be immediate child elements of the div, but they will not be immediate child elements of the section.
So what?
And if I remove the commas, all of these elements now will actually just go inside this div. So they'll be immediate child elements of the div, but they will not be immediate child elements of the section. Hopefully that distinction.
Wait. Let me try removing the comma and see what the changes. I didn't completely get it. So let's go back and inspect. Look at the structure. So we have a section tag, then we have a span, BR, then we have a list. What does you stand for again? Unordered list, right? Yeah, it's unordered list. Okay. Let's remove the comma here. I mean the comma from here. Is this what you removed? Oh, okay. Huh. That's oh, maybe it's just white doing its thing and showing us the UI there.
Makes sense. Child
Oh,
elements of
yeah,
the div,
okay.
but they will not be immediate child elements of the section. Hopefully that distinction. So they'll be commas. All if I actually just take this whole thing and if I put this in a div, and if I remove the commas, all of these elements.
Oh, okay. I see what he did. So rather than having this, he just had a div element, and inside that div element, he had the these. So what happens is that rather than like the section would have a div, and all these tags would be inside the div. So in a way, I guess the section tag would become kind of a grandparent tag. Yes, if we are talking in terms of hierarchy. Well, that makes sense. So let's go back.
Elements now will actually just go inside this div. So they'll be immediate child elements of the div, but they will not be immediate child elements of the section. Hopefully that distinction makes sense. Okay, but again, you're never going to really use create element to actually create your components. So you don't have to worry so much about this if this is a little bit confusing. Just stick to creating your components the first way that I showed you, just like this. But I just figured I would show this to you all just to kind of give you all a little history lesson, because this was how you would create components back then in very early stages of React. Okay, and I'm talking about like 9-10 years ago when React first came out. But okay, let's go ahead and move on. So now what we're going to do is talk about component props in React. So what exactly are props, or short for properties? Well, props are pretty much just data that
Okay, I'm gonna assume first what props are. Basically, if you want to create multiple, they're basically arguments, right? Like if you want to create multiple users, you just pass in the value and it gets attached here. And let's see what props are.
you are passing in to your components. And those components can take in those props, they can take in that data, and they can do literally whatever they want with it. They can use that data and render it to the document. They can take that data and send it to a server by making an API call. They can take that data and pass it to another component. They can take that data and concatenate it, assuming it's a string or even a number. They can concatenate it with another piece of string or another number. They can do math operations such as adding that piece of data with another numeric value. Whatever it is, you can do literally anything you want with props. Okay? So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to go ahead and
Sure thing. Take care, chicken. See ya. Bye.
let me create a couple more components. So I'll go ahead and create a new file. I'll call this username.jsx. And these are just going to be very simple components, but the idea is to show you how props work. So export function username. And this component's purpose is going to display the user's username. Okay? So we're going to return a div. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to also make sure I prefix the username with the actual. So we're going to return a div. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to also make sure okay? So we're going to return a div.
Let's create a new component file first and then create the actual component.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to also make sure I prefix the username with the actual, with a label or some text that indicates that this is the username. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a span tag. Or actually not span, I'm going to use the b tag, which bolds this text. Okay? And what I want to do is I want to render the username in this span tag right over here. Okay? Now here's the thing though, how do I actually render the username itself, right? Well, this is where we need to actually pass data to this username component. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go into our user profile component, so where we are going to render our username component. So I'm going to remove this p tag right over here where I rendered this hard-coded username Bob text, and I'm going to render username, just like that. Okay? And to pass a prop to a component, it's very easy. All you do is in between where these angle brackets are, and right after where you have your component name. So after user, all you to render user. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go into our user profile component, so where we are going to render our username component. So I'm going to remove this p tag right over here where I rendered this hard-coded username Bob text, and I'm going to render username, just like that. Okay? And to pass a prop to a component, it's very easy. All you do is in between where these angle brackets are, and right after where you have your component name. So after username, I'm going to go ahead and give my prop a name. Now, if you're using TypeScript, which since we're not using TypeScript, you would need to actually have type annotations for your components, okay, which makes it very strict, which is actually a good thing, because that way you're not just randomly passing in random props to components that don't need that data. But since we're using JavaScript, I can literally pass in any prop, give it any name I want, but I'll show you also how to validate props later on using a package called prop types. So I'm going to go ahead and give my prop a name. So I'm going to call it username. You want to make sure you're giving your props relative names to the data that it is. So for example, if that data is username or if it's email, you want to make sure the prop corresponds to that piece of data. So username, and we want to have an equal sign. And we're going to be passing a string down to this username component for this username prop. So I'm going to use equal sign, and I'm going to go ahead and give it the name Bob, just like this. And now we need to go to the actual component that is going to be receiving this prop. And in order for us to actually be able to reference this username prop, the way that we handle that is, well, this username, remember, this is a function. And what's really happening is we're actually passing in this username prop as an argument to this function. In other words, when you actually render your components in React, you're actually really just calling the function itself. Okay, you're actually just calling this username function, except you're calling it by using these angle brackets tags. Okay, when you pass in props, you're actually just passing in an argument to that function. So all of those props, you can pass in as many props as you want. All of those props are all encapsulated into an object, and that object gets passed into the component function, and that argument is just called props. Whoops, props, just like that. Let me show you what happens if I were to console log props. Let's go into our browser, and you'll see how over here, if I go to the what happens if I were to console log props. into our browser, and you'll see how over here, if I go to the console, which you actually may have already saw that props and that argument, all those tags. Okay, when you pass them,
Okay, first let's remove the import chain from here and move that to user profile. And then add that in here. And let's go and import the new component user username.
and props, you're actually just passing in an argument to that function. So all of those
And we can remove username from here and we can just call the username. And let's see if I go into console, what happened there? Seems like we got an error. Let's see. Failed to resolve. Oh, okay, I see. Let's remove this. Oh, not from here, from app. Wait. Failed to resolve from user profile. Okay. User favorite foods from slash component slash user favorite foods.jsx. Maybe I need to close all and then just. Okay, seems like we have a bug at our hands. Let's see how we can fix this. Hmm. Oh, wait a second. Line 18, import. No, it's in line 17, alright. Line 17 of user profile. Wait, line 17. So I guess it starts from map and then that's 17. So let's just copy this, put it in here. Huh. Components slash user favorite foods. User favorite foods. Have I Oh, okay, I see. Oh, never mind, I don't see. Fail to resolve import this from this. What? Are all the import statements correct inside well everything? Export function user favorite foods. And what about app? Hmm. I'm pretty sure this is a very silly error of some sort. But okay, let's try to resolve it. It's inside the error is in user profile, right? In this line. Okay, let's just remove this and see if it works. That worked, and we also got okay, let me write the statement again. From dot slash. Oh, that worked. What did I have before this? I'm just gonna control Z. What's that? Hey there, puppy taps or yeah, that's. Oh, thank you so much. And I think I did resolve it. I believe I had something else written here. So let me just see what it was. Okay, I see. Like I don't if I'm importing the function from here, I need to specify dot components as the folder, but since I'm importing it from here, I mean I don't have to do that, do I? So I just need to do this and I mean add a dot and that should work. Alright, there we go. So um next let's come back to our course. So first and foremost, it is showing us our props, like it is logging the username that we gave. Let's go into user profile or JSX. There we go. So I guess I can
Using
we
these
can
little
access the props now from here.
brackets tags. Okay, when you pass in props, you're actually just passing in an argument.
So I guess what would you do? You would actually let's go back to username and let's have username. How do we can we use template literals inside JSX?
To that function.
Let's
So all
just
of those
check.
props, you can pass in as many props as you want. All of those props are all encapsulated into an object, and that object gets passed into the component function, and that argument is just called props. Whoops, props, just like that. Let me show you what happens if I were to console log props. Let's go into our browser, and you'll see how over here, if I go to the console, which you actually may have already saw that already, but if I go over here to console, if I refresh the page, you'll see that we have username Bob, okay, as a field or a key value pair, and it's in this object right over here. As an example, let's say if I want to pass in some more props, so let's just pass in, let's just say trimmed username, just as an example. You'll see now both username and trimmed username are in this single props object right over here. Now, if I wanted to reference either one of these props, username or trimmed username, all I have to do is just reference it by just using the dot operator, so props dot, and then the name of the field, and that's always going to match the name of the prop. So username.
Or in other
username
words, we
source.
just use regular node from now on.
Now you can see right over here, it is complaining because we have ESLint enabled. It's complaining about it missing prop validation. The code should still work. The application should still run. It's just that your VS Code is just giving this ESLint warning. Your application will work fine though. But if I refresh, you'll see now it is logging just Bob because I am referencing props.username. If I reference props.trimmed username, it's going to log Bob as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Now we want to actually render the username to the document. We're going to do that inside these span tags. Now in order to actually render the username, we know that it's coming from that props.username field, which is actually a field inside the object. Before we rendered a username by hard coding it to the document, but this time we actually have this value that is defined in a field, or you can kind of think of it as like a variable, right? How do we actually render that? How do we actually extract that value from that field and then render it to the document? We're going to do something called evaluation. So for example, if I reference props.username right over here, this is a literal value. And in the document, it'll just literally render props.username. That's not what we want. We want to actually evaluate this object's field, so that way we actually get the value itself. To do that, we're going to actually wrap this in between a pair of curly braces. So this will evaluate this props.username field, and then it'll grab us that username value.
I guess this is kind of similar to how Jinja works. Although it's been quite some time since I used it. Jinja is the templating language. It probably has some other name, but it's a templating language which you can use to have Python code inside, or something similar to Python code inside your HTML. And it's used a lot in Flask, and I also believe Django too. Jinja too. It's okay. Yeah, it's a web template engine. Okay, I guess that's the more apt tech term. Yeah, in Jinja also, I believe, or if my memory serves right, I believe you use curly braces and the curly braces to do this.
So if you look at the document right now, you can see that Bob is being displayed to the document because this username field was evaluated. I'm going to go ahead and remove this console log. Now you can pass in other data types as well. You don't have to only pass in strings. So just as an example, let's remove trimmed username. Let's do this. So
And let's can we also use, I guess you can also use functions, right? So if I call to uppercase, I guess it doesn't like semicolons there. Yeah, there we go. We got our user.
So why don't I do this? Let's go into our app component, the root component, and we'll pass in props to user profile. So let's pass in the age of the user. So what I'll do is inside this div, I'm going to go ahead and do this. Let me remove these two span tags. Let me remove this div actually. So I'll use a bold tag and I'll do age and then span. And then we're going to go ahead and expect props. So let me go ahead and pass that as a argument for the user profile function. And then we're going to go ahead and reference props. And the name of the prop will be age, so props.age. And then remember, we're evaluating that by using a pair of curly braces. So now let's go into our app.jsx file, or really any file wherever you are rendering the user profile component. And then we want to pass in that age prop. So since we are rendering the user profile component,
I'm sorry, go back.
Go into our app.jsx.
I see. So inside this, we're gonna assume that we get an age, and I mean, not assume, we will write that out later, but I get the point. So to be remove email, I believe
File, we're really evaluating that. And then we're going to go in the age of the user. So what I'll do is inside this div, I'm going to go ahead and do this. Let me remove these two span tags. Let me remove this div actually. So I'll use a bold tag and I'll do age and then span. And then we're going to go ahead and expect props. So let me go ahead and pass that as a argument for the user profile function. And then we're going to go ahead and reference props. And the name of the prop will be age, so props.age. And then remember, we're evaluating that by using a pair of curly braces. So now let's go into our app.jsx file, or really any file wherever you are rendering the user profile component. And then we want to pass in that age prop. So since we are passing in a numeric value, we need to actually use a pair of curly braces. Okay, if I actually use quotation mark.
So let's go back to where we're calling user profile. I believe that's in app.jsx, right? And then we'll pass in,
like I did earlier to pass in a string, it would pass in this numeric value as a string. So if I put 20, it would treat that age prop as a string instead of a number. And you'll see right over here, if I actually rendered, or not rendered, console log props, and if I went to my browser, you'll see that it's treating the field as a string instead of a numeric value, which is not what we want. Because you might want to do some kind of arithmetic, and you'll have to worry about parsing it first. So what we'll do is we'll use curly braces and then pass in the number 20 just like this. And now if I save and go back to the browser, you'll see now the number 20 doesn't have quotation marks in between or around it. So now this is an actual numeric value. So you don't have to worry about parsing it at all. Okay, and then now if you see right over here, it is rendering that prop. It is rendering the age 20 just fine. So that's good. And then you can also pass in booleans if you wanted to. So for example, let's say if I wanted to pass in, let's say for user profile, let's say we want to pass a prop called is logged in, and let's set this to true. Okay, and then let's just evaluate the prop right now. Props is logged in. Now it's not going to actually show you anything because it's a boolean, so it's not even going to render the text at all. But I could just do something like this where I call a function or call the string constructor, and then evaluate that. So you'll see true is being rendered, and I can change this to false. Again, just showing you this as an example. Later on, you'll learn about conditional rendering, so you'll see how we can use a boolean to render specific stuff to the document. Okay, so that's just an example. You can pass in arrays. So let's just say, for example, for user profile, we have favorite foods, and this might
Basically, if it,
be an array of favorite foods. So this will be like an array of objects. So let's just
basically if it's not a string, you have to use these curly braces. But what if it's a object? Can you do that? Would you have to
say
do curly
name sushi.
braces?
Okay, and then what you would do is you would reference the prop, which you'll see right over here, favorite foods. Whoops, let me go to the console. You'll see favorite foods is in fact an array. And then what you would want to do is something called dynamic rendering, or in other words, rendering lists. So you would take that props dot favorite foods array, and then you would iterate through it, and then you would render basically each object as an actual renderable element, which is something that I will show you later on. Okay, so yeah, you can literally pass in anything you want. You can pass in an object as well. You can pass in, you can even pass in a function. So let's say, for example, if I had call me, so let's create a random function. Let's do this. Let's not use an alert. Let's just do console log hello. And then let's just do call me. Let's just pass as a prop. You'll see now the object props has this call me field, which is a function. And then you can see that it has the implementation right over here. But what I could do is I could just immediately call props.callme like that. And you'll see that when I refresh the page, it console logs hello, which is pretty much calling this call me function. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, you can pass in literally anything you want. So now I'm going to show you.
Okay, before we start, actually, let's just come to this point, like have those different parameters he has mentioned that, and then I'm gonna take a short break and I'll be right back. But yeah, let me make this out first. So I need to go to wherever user profile is defined. I mean called, which is in app.jsx. I guess I'll be logging in. Let's have a new line. Is logged in false, and then you have favorite words. Oh yeah, and you also don't need commas in between to separate each. I want to call them quarks, but no, they're called props, right? They're not called quarks. I guess props is short for properties. So let's have name, pizza,
You have literally anything you want.
and he has a arrow function.
It console logs hello, which is pretty much calling this call.
And then I guess yeah, we're gonna also pass called me as a prop. So let's do it in a new line. Did I delete something? No, I didn't.
Call me function. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, you can pass in literally anything you want. So now I'm going to show you how to
And let's go back. And yeah, there you go. You have hello locked to the console. All right. I'm gonna take a quick break and I'll be right back. See you then. Alright, everyone, I'm back. So let's continue with our React learning. Why can't I open up? Huh. Okay, that worked.
Use a third-party package called prop types. This is very important for type checking your component props because you can see we are able to pass in any type of prop that we want without even validating it at all. And that's not good because you always want to make sure you are validating what your component is taking in as a prop. And then you also want to make sure that those props are actually being
If I'm not like I'm assuming here, but really that's the number one reason why people use TypeScript, right? Because TypeScript simply won't allow you to do things without type checking.
passed in if a component expects one. So what we'll do is we'll install this package. So we're going to go into our terminal and type in npm prop types.
npm I prop. Okay, install prop types. Okay.
All right, let me go ahead and run my app again. Perfect. All right.
Yes,
So
we could.
now what we're going to do
Let's do it here.
is anywhere that we have a component. So let's go into user profile. Okay. We're going to go ahead and import this package. And I'm actually going to do this on the first line. So we're going to import prop types like this from prop hyphen
nm. Okay, it's npm, not nmp.
on the first line. So we're going to import prop types like this from prop hyphen types, just like that. Okay. Once we import that, we can go ahead and take our user profile function. So user profile dot, and then you can basically dynamically attach this property, prop types, just like this, to your function itself. Okay. So user profile dot prop types. And then inside this object over here, you want to basically define the props that this component is expecting. So for example, this component right over here expects currently only one prop, but you know what I'll do is I'll actually do this. I'm going to take this username prop. Let's do this. Go back to app. I'm going to pass in a username to user profile. So let's just do Bob. And we're going to, this is known as prop drilling, by the way. We're going to take the prop that we passed from the app component to user profile. We're going to take that prop and then pass it to username component. So props.username.
Sorry, what?
File. We're going to take that prop and then pass it to username component. So props.username, just like this. Okay, so I'm basically taking the prop.
No, what's the name for that?
That was passed to user profile and then passing it down one more layer to its child component username. And you can definitely do this. Okay, so we have so far, I guess, 3 props. So let's go ahead and go back to.
No, what's the you mentioned the name.
This is known as prop drilling, by the way. We're going
Prop drilling, okay? Prop drilling in React. Okay.
to take the prop that we passed from the app component to user profile. We're going to take that prop and then pass it to username component. So props.username, just like this. Okay. So I'm basically taking the
And am I passing a username in app? I mean, to user profile. Let me define a username here. Let's just keep it Bob. That's all. Just close the other tab. All right. Let's continue.
that was passed to user profile and then passing it down one more layer to its child component username. And you can definitely do this. Okay, so we have so far, I guess, 3 props. So let's go ahead and go back to our prop types object. So the first one that we'll handle is username. So we'll define the prop names. So username just like this, and you'll notice how as soon as I type username, this lint error goes away. Okay. So what we want to do is set the data type for username. So we'll do prop type. So we're referencing the prop types import from up top over here, and then we're going to do dot string. So this basically tells JavaScript as well as React that okay, this username prop is a string. And
let's import prop types first of all into user profile. So import prop type. Oh, okay, it auto completed that for me. I guess that's the power of VS Code. And let's go down here and define the prop type.
And then we can additionally also make this prop mandatory by adding this is required at the end. So dot string dot is required. So it's pretty much chainable if you think about it. Like if you think of it like this, it's kind of like you're calling a method, and then that method returns the same instance that method was called on, and then you can basically call the same method again. So in this situation, we can call, or not call, but reference string, and then reference is required, and then there's really nothing else to reference anymore after that. But yeah, you get the idea. So now watch what happens when I go to the browser. Let me go ahead and open up the DevTools. Okay, so watch what happens if I do this. Let's say if I go back to app.jsx, and if I don't pass a username, and if I go into the browser, if I refresh, you're going to see that it gives us a warning. The application doesn't break, but it gives us a warning, and it says failed prop type. The prop username is marked as required in user profile, but its value is undefined. So this is basically telling you that you need to make sure you pass in the prop for to app.jsx, and if I don't pass a username, and if I go into the browser, if I refresh, you're going to see that it gives us a warning. The application doesn't break, but it gives us a warning, and it says failed prop type. The prop username is marked as required in user profile.
I guess I removed the. Just go back. Or because I'm using two uppercase, that throws an error. So let's go and remove that inside user username. So, yeah, where's the error? Yeah, warning, failed prop type. Required in user profile, but its value is undefined.
File,
Okay.
but its value is undefined. So this is basically telling you that you need to make sure you pass in the prop for username. So this is good because if we don't pass in a prop for something that is required, then it's going to complain. And notice how if I were to pass in anything but a string, so if I pass in an array, whoops, let's go back to the browser. You're going to see right over here, it gives us a warning, a failed prop type, invalid prop username of type array supplied to user profile, expected string. Let's go ahead and pass Bob back, and that should fix everything, so no more warnings. Good. Let's go ahead and type, I shouldn't say type annotate, I was going to say type annotate because I'm used to TypeScript. Let's go ahead and add prop, or type checks for the other props. So let's go ahead and type check age. So we'll do age, and we'll do prop types. So this is going to be a number. So there is number right over here, and then we'll do is required, and then we'll do the same thing for this call me function.
Can you have or I guess it would get treated as an object if I have. Let's just check. Oh, I guess not. Okay, let's just retry. No, it does get treated as a string itself.
Function. So
I guess for objects, you'll need to have another curly brace. I mean, let's just try it out. So let's have something like this. And does it complain? Okay, I guess we'll remove it. It brought up some bugs or something. So let's just have Bob. Yeah, let's just remove the curly brace for strings. Reload. All the others are gone now, and let's go
we'll
back.
do call me prop types dots, and then there's this func property, and then we'll do let's see, is required, just like that. Okay, so now we are, and there's this func property.
Okay, let's just go to our prop types too and make the changes. So age prop type dot number dot is required. Then we have call me, which is a function. So let's have that. Let's have prop types dot function dot is required.
And then we'll do, let's see, is required, just like that. Okay, so now we are making sure that username, age, and call me all are being passed as props. Okay, so these are all required. Now, what if you wanted to have a prop that was optional? Well, you can do that. So let's say, for example, let's say this is login prop. Okay, let's go ahead and add this. So is logged in. We'll do prop types. The type of this is going to be a bool or boolean. So they have bool. And then if you don't want it to be required, in other words, if you want it to be optional, then you just omit this is required right over here. So you don't add is required. Okay, you leave that out. So now, if I were to not pass is logged in as a prop, if I go back to the browser, you'll see that we don't have any errors. But if I were to add is required at the end, you'll see that now it complains about the isLogin prop because it is required. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, now you can also check the props for arrays as well. So right over here, I have this favorite foods prop, and this is an array. And let's say I want to make sure that this array has consistent values. Okay, so for this example right over here, I have an array of objects. Let's add a few more objects. And let me also add another property. Let me give this an ID, and let me capitalize this, and let me do the same thing down here. So let's do pizza and ID. Okay, and I want to make sure that this array has consistent objects. So in other words,
Let's have a number for the ID. So let's make sure that we have pizza, burger. We could have shawarma.
I don't want this array to just have a bunch of random elements in there. I don't want this array to have a mix of numbers, strings, booleans, objects. I want to have only objects, and I also want each object to be the same and have the same fields. So what I can do is I can go back to my user profile, and down over here, I can add a check for favorite foods. So favorite foods, like this, and then we'll reference prop types. And what I want to do here is I want to reference array of, not array, but array of, okay? If you have an array that you're passing as a prop that just has literally anything you want, and you only care that it's an array, you don't care of what the contents look like, then you would use array. So in other words, let's say if you're just passing in an array and it has a number, it has a string, it has an object, then you could just use array. Okay, array is good for just checking to see if the prop is an array,
If it's
not for
an
checking
array,
to see
okay.
if the contents of the array is valid or not. So in our situation, we want to use array of. And then this time over here, I'm going to actually pass in prop types.shape because we care for the shape of our object over here. So prop types.shape allows us to check for a specific object and making sure that that object has a specific shape. Okay, so we're basically combining two things together. So now what I'm going to do inside when I call shape is I'm just going to pass an object, and then I can do the same thing that I've been doing up top over here for these 4 fields for the fields for the object. So I'm going to specify name, and then prop types.string is required, and then same thing for ID, prop types.
We kind of give it the, in other words, we kind of give it the skeleton of what the elements of the array should be. So here we kind of see that the elements of the array should be an object, and the object should have name, and the name should be a string, and yes, it's a required string, not optional. And similarly, we have an ID, which in our case would be a integer. An integer, maybe it's called, yeah, it's called a number. Then it's also required. It's a required field, not an optional one. And I believe that should work.
Okay, it can look a little bit complex, but just know that what we're really doing is, one, we're validating the object right over here that is inside the favorite foods array, and then we're making sure that this favorite foods array is an array of all of these objects that have this shape. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So now what I'll do is this. So if I go to the browser, let me refresh, you'll see that we have no errors, but notice what happens.
Let's check. And I'm gonna change this to string to see if an error would be raised. And if I retry, an error is not raised. Okay. Maybe I need to save. This is weird. Let's check it out. Favorite food. I believe I named it as favorite foods in here, right? Yeah. Okay, that would be the reason, perhaps. And I guess maybe if I do is required in here, and if I rename this so that it doesn't exist, does it give me an error or not? Maybe I need to, let's go back to user profile, and use is required before I use .array of. Okay, alright, I guess I can't do that. Okay, anyway, let's just continue. So let's go back. Name it as favorite foods and go back. We have favorite foods in here. And it does give me an error. It says that favorite foods ID should be numbers. So I guess what we'll do is it even gives me the index of which value in the array failed. And so let's do it as prop types dot number dot is required. That should work. In fact, if I reload, there you go, that works.
If one, let's just say if I pass in an object, you'll see that it complains because it is expecting an array right over here. It's saying that it expected an array. If I pass in an array, this works. But let's say if I pass in an array with an empty object, you'll see that it now complains because although we do have an array with an object, with one element, that's an object, the object is empty, but the object does not take in the correct shape. You can see that over here that the shape of the object does not have the name property that is required. Okay, now let's say if I add the name property, it's now going to complain saying that the ID is not there. Okay, so we need the entire thing. So let me go ahead and paste that back here. And now the errors are all gone, but notice how if I remove ID from just one of the objects, it's going to go ahead and complain. And also tells you the specific index of the array that it is having an issue with. So in this case, you can see it says index 1, so that's this element over here. Okay, so now you know how to validate arrays as well as validating the specific object for the array itself. So hopefully all of this makes sense. Now, one thing that I want to quickly mention with our components is that we actually have a parent-to-child relationship, and we also have sibling components as well. So let me emphasize a little bit about that, because this is actually a very important concept to understand when it comes to developing really any application, okay? If you understand object-oriented programming, this is something that should come easy to you. So right now we have our root component, we have app. Now, app has one child component that we are rendering called user profile. The moment that you render a component inside another component, which is what we're doing right over here, that immediately creates a parent-to-child and child-to-parent relationship, okay, for components. So app has user profile, okay? If we go into the user profile component, we can see that user profile also has components being rendered as well. We have two components being rendered inside user profile, okay? If I take away user profile, if I don't render user profile, that means that user username as well as user favorite foods, these components that are being rendered inside user profile will not exist in the document itself unless if I explicitly rendered those two components directly inside the app component, okay? So user profile also has child components as well. It has user username as well as user favorite foods. So that makes user profile the parent of these two components, and these two components are children of the user profile component, okay? And of course, the hierarchy can go down infinite amount of times. If user username had any child components being rendered, then those child components would be children of user username, and that would make user username a parent component, okay? Now, because user username as well as user favorite foods component share the same parents,
There would be siblings.
user profile, this automatically makes them sibling components. The nice thing with sibling components is that you can share the same props that were passed to its parents. So for example, all of these props, username, age, favorite foods, and this call me function that I am passing down to the user profile component, all these props can be passed to both user username and user favorite foods, allowing me to share those props between these two siblings. Now that's useful because sometimes we may want to share very similar props between different components. Maybe user favorite foods needs the username as well as the user username component. So we may want to consider passing the username prop to the user favorite foods component as well. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. Later on, you'll see more examples where when we work with state, you'll see how when I update one state variable, you'll see how it will reflect all of the child components and the sibling components as well. Okay, and then I'll also show you how I can update data from a child component and have that reflect the parent component as well. Okay, but I just wanted to go over this very quickly because it is something very important to understand in React, but we'll dive deeper into this when we get into working with state. Now, one more thing with components that I want to talk about are React fragments. This is actually something very, very important to understand in React, and knowing when to use it is actually very, very beneficial for your situation. So right now, all of our components have one root element that we are returning. So remember what I said, a component is a function that returns a JSX element or JSX expression. In this situation, we're returning a div, and this div can have as many HTML elements as we want. However, if I remove this div right over here, you see that it actually errors out and is complaining, saying that we must have one parent element. That's because by default, I can't just return two HTML elements just like this, okay? Now you might be wondering, well, maybe you might want this bold element as well as a span element to be rendered to the document. And let's say, for example, this user username component is being rendered inside user profile. You might want these two elements to be immediate children of wherever this component is being rendered. So it's being rendered right over here. So you want those two elements to be immediate child elements of this div right over here. Okay. Now, how can I achieve that without needing to wrap them inside a div, right? Because the moment that I wrap it inside a div, it becomes a child element of the div. Now, it still technically is a child element of the root div, the outer div, that wherever it's being rendered. But sometimes having these elements being wrapped inside another element can break CSS, or it can break your selectors. For example, you might have specific selectors that you're using that need to target immediate child elements, okay? So I'm just using that as an example. So what we can do to add these two elements to the document without needing to add this div is use a fragment. And it's actually very easy to use. So there's two ways that you can use a fragment syntactically. So the first way is you can do it like this. You can reference react.fragment, just like this, whoops, fragment. And then you want to make sure you close that as well right over here. Okay, we do need to import React up top over here, so import React from React. Okay, and now notice what happens in the DOM tree. So if I
All right, let's apply that change and then we look at the output. So let's go to user username. So we basically don't want to have this div parent element, and we want the p tag and the span tag to be direct children of whatever component is the parent component. So I'm gonna import React from React, and then we'll be using this React dot fragment. I'm not sure what we'll call it. Would we call it as a component or as a method or function? Yeah, whatever it is, whatever name we give it, we'll use it here, and we'll be able to achieve what we wanted without giving a parent element. If I go back, Rick, I think I closed. Okay, there we go. Yeah, but now it doesn't apply the space, so I
I were
guess
to
we
go
have to
into
use
my
a
browser,
BR
and
tag.
if I expand the HTML elements, you'll see now we have both of our elements that are from user username component, and they don't have that root div anymore, and they're immediate children of its parent component's root element, also known as the user profile component. Okay, they become immediate child elements of this div with this user profile ID. Okay, you can see that right over here. If I remove this React fragment and if I change it back to a div, you can see that that div gets added to the document, and it's wrapping both this bold element as well as this span element right over here. Okay, and again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's really up to you on how you want to structure your HTML. Remember, there's no right or wrong answer with HTML and CSS. It's how you want to structure things. I'm only showing you this because you might have certain needs that might make it so that you don't want this div to actually be added to the document because of styling issues, or maybe you might have specific selectors that you need to target this bold element as an example, and you cannot have this div right over there. Okay, so using a fragment would solve that issue. Now, the shorthand way to use fragments is actually, instead of just using React.fragment, you just use an empty tag just like this. Okay, so you literally just do angle brackets, you don't put anything in between, and then you close it just like this. So angle brackets and then put a forward slash, and then you're done. And that's literally a fragment, a shorthand syntax for fragments, and it does the same exact thing. Okay, if I were to go into user profile, I can literally remove this div right over here and wrap all of these elements, all my components and elements in a fragment. And if you see right over here, now all of these elements are immediate children and elements in a fragment profile. I can literally remove this div right over here and wrap all of these elements, all my components and elements in a fragment. And if you see right over here, now all of these syntax for fragments, and it does the same exact thing. Okay, if I were to go into user profile, I can literally remove this div right over here and wrap all of these elements, all my components and elements in a fragment. And if you see right over here, now all of these elements are immediate children of this div, and that div is this div right over here, which is the root element of app. Okay, since user profile is the only component that I'm rendering, I can actually just remove this div. And now you can see that since user profile is the only component that I'm rendering, I can actually just remove this div. And now you can see that all of these elements are immediate child elements of the root div, which comes from our app. Okay, since user profile is the only component that I'm rendering, I can actually just remove this div. And now you can see that.
Which div?
Okay, since user profile is the only component that I'm rendering, I can actually just remove this div. And now you can see that okay, since user profile is the only component that I'm rendering, I can actually just remove this div.
Okay, I guess just for that, we'll also remove our hello React h1 tag we had set up. And that doesn't work for some reason. Close all.
And now you can see that since user profile is the only component that I'm rendering, I can actually just remove this div.
Oh, I guess we need to have a bracket here so that the interpreter can reach this statement. And there we go.
And now you can see that all of these elements are immediate child elements of the root div, which comes from our entry point right over here. Okay, so hopefully fragments make sense. And again, there are many different ways that you can use fragments. Like I said, you can use the group components together. So if I wanted to just render let's say, for example, I want to render user username with user favorite foods together. I can group them together just like this with a fragment, and I don't need to worry about adding an extra HTML node to the document. Not that this would really change anything in terms of your tree structure for your application, but it is a way to group stuff together. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay, because sometimes, like I said, you want to
And let's go back and
group elements together. You want them to be all grouped together, but you don't want them to be wrapped inside a div, because that div could, let's say, put them all in the same row, or maybe it might put them all in the same line, whatever it is, it could break CSS. So using a fragment could help in some situations. Again, this all primarily depends on how you structure your CSS. So you have to make sure you understand, okay, what exactly is my CSS targeting, and should I use a fragment for this to achieve what I want to do? So hopefully React fragments make sense. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about styling in React. So this is just going to be a short little section. We're not going to go in depth on CSS because it's not a CSS tutorial, but I did want to show you how to at least style your React application as well as style components. So we're going to start off with some basic CSS files. So what we'll do is we'll apply what's called a global style. So global style basically just means that you want to apply your styles globally throughout your entire application, so literally everywhere. So in other words, let's say, for example, I want to apply a global background. Maybe I want to apply a dark color background everywhere throughout the application. So how would I do that? Well, in order to apply a global style, we want to make sure that we have first a CSS file. So I'll create one. Let's create a new file. We'll call this globals.css. Okay. And this is where all of my global CSS will be defined. So what I want is I want to make sure I have a dark background color. So what I'll do is this. We'll start off with a body tag, and then we'll do background color. And then let's start with 000. And I'm going to use this VS Code feature to kind of like change the background color. So I'm going to use 1E, 1E, 1E. And I also want to change the text color to be, I guess, white. Maybe not white, but just like a slight light color. So that way we can actually see the text. And now to apply the CSS to our actual application, because right now it's not being applied, what we need to do is we need to go to our value of username.
oops, what happened there? Go back.
An object fragments make sense. As well, a color CR, the CSS to our white, but just like a slight light color. So that way we can actually see the text. And now to apply the CSS to our actual application, because right now it's not being applied, what we need to do is we need to go to our entry point of our application, and we just want to import that globals.css file just like this. And now you'll see that the CSS is being applied to our application. We basically inverted the colors. We made the text white and we made the background dark. Okay, so that's how you can apply global CSS. So this is where I would recommend you set things such as the font family. So if you wanted to set the font family, you could do basically in CSS file just like this. And now you'll see.
Oh, okay. We just have to import it. We don't need to pass it to anything. All right.
That the CSS is being applied to our application. We basically inverted the colors. We made the text white and we made the background dark. Okay, so that's how you can apply global CSS. So this is where I would recommend you set things such as the font family. So if you wanted to set the font family, you could do that right over here. So let's say if I wanted to set it to, I don't know, sans serif. Maybe I don't have that font. Oh, right there. Oh, there you go. The font just changed. Okay. If you wanted it to set, let's say, you can also set like a height as well. Set the height to 100%. And basically any global CSS you want to put inside this file. Okay. Let's talk about component level CSS, because obviously we have our global CSS, but then we have our components where we want specific CSS applied to it. Okay. So let's say, for example, maybe for my, let's do user username. Okay. Let's say for this user username component, I want specific CSS applied to the font, to the color of the text, whatever it is, right? I want to make sure that I'm applying it only to this component and not globally throughout the entire application. Okay, so what I want to do is this. There's two ways that I can do this. One, I could just do an inline style. So I'll show you how to do that. So let's say if I wanted to change the font size of this username text, I can just go to the tag itself and I can style and then equal sign. And then you want to provide a pair of curly braces. So with inline styling in React, it's way different than how you would write it in just regular HTML. So in React, you want to actually pass an object into this object over here or into this pair of curly braces right over here, just like that. And basically, this object will have all of these CSS properties. So for example, if you wanted to apply the font size, you would just do font size, and you could pass in a string. So let's do 32. And now if I go to the document, you can see that. Let me just make sure I'm not zoomed in. Oh, I was zoomed in. Let me see. Let's change this to, oh, it should be 32 pixels. Sorry about that. So now I can see that it is being applied to the username text. And if I look in the dev tools, you'll see that this this b tag right over here has this style attribute and then it has font size. So again, this is how it would look like in HTML, but in React, you want to make sure that you're applying it inside this object right over here. If I want to change the color, I would just do color, and then I want to set it to, let's say, maybe a red color like that, and then that would be applied right over there. Okay, so that's how you do it in line. Let's show you a couple more examples. There's also, let's see, there's font size, font family. Maybe you don't like the default font that we set globally, so you can do something like cursive, and then that would change right over there. Okay, there are a bunch. Again, you can just go through IntelliSense and look through all the other ones. But if there's one that you want, and you know the name of it, just remember that it's the same name as it is in just a regular HTML attribute. You just need to make sure that you're using camel case. So notice how in HTML, right, you have, let me show you, you have font hyphen size. That's how you would write it in just regular plain HTML. But in React or in JSX, you would write font and then capital S size and no space or no hyphen at all, just like this. Okay, and then you want to make sure it's inside the object. So hopefully that makes sense. So now let me show you how to do it, not with inline, but at the component layer with an actual CSS file. So what we're going to do is inside our components folder, I'll create a new file and I'll call it styles.css. And what I'm going to do here is just create a class. So I'll call it username, and I'll just give it the same styles. And remember, this is a regular CSS file, so you're just going to write CSS regularly. So instead of font size like this, where we did that in the JSX, we're just going to do font hyphen size in 32 pixels. Set the color to red. Now we're going to go back to our username component, and in here, I want to import this styles.css file that I just created. So we're going to import it like this: import pair of quotation marks, and then the relative path styles.css. And then if you look in the browser, nothing has changed so far. The relative path styles.css. And then if you look in the browser, nothing has changed so far with the username. And that's because we need to make sure we apply the class name to whichever tag we're trying to style. Okay, it's exactly the same way that you would do it in just plain HTML. So I want to style this bold tag, this b tag. So I'm going to give it a class name. So we're going to use this class name attribute. In regular HTML, it's just class, but in JSX, it's class name. Okay, and this is where you're starting to realize the differences between HTML and JSX. Even though, again, 95% of it will look identical, there are still a lot of things that are different. Actually, I should say 90%. So we're going to do class name equals, and then now just the name of the class. So the name of the class is username. So we'll just do username just like this. If I save, you're going to see now we see the style is being applied to username. It has a font size of 32 pixels, and then the color is red. And you can even look in...
Let's update this.
The dev tools, we should see this right over here. So this element, this bold element, has a class called username, and when I click on this, you can see all the styles that are applied to it. Okay. Now, one more thing that I do also want to mention too is even if I were to, let's say, go into this styles.css file, and let's say if I modify the body CSS. Okay, so let's say if I do body and then background color, let's do aqua. Okay. If I refresh, you'll see that it actually does not get applied to the actual document itself. Now I want to show you as well, right over here, if I go to body, you'll see that in the dev tools, it actually shows two body tag styles, okay? And this one right over here is actually just being ignored. You can see it has this line struck through. This one over here just means being ignored because we have this one overriding it, basically, okay? If I were to remove this background color style, okay, and sometimes you do need to make sure you refresh as well because it doesn't actually reflect properly, but this time I can see that it is properly being reflected. You can see over here that I am setting the background color to aqua because in the globals.css file, my root CSS file, I'm not setting that CSS style in the body tag, okay? But since I set over here, it's not going to override it. I could override it if I wanted to by just using the exclamation mark important, and then now you can see that it is being overridden, okay? So hopefully this makes sense. I do also want to show you one more way on how you can write CSS as well as style your components using CSS modules, okay? And CSS modules are actually very, very common. A lot of people actually like using CSS modules because they're more prone to less issues when it comes to styling your components because, one, they are locally scoped to the component, okay? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and rename styles.css to styles.module.css. And instead of importing it like this, I'm going to go ahead and actually import it like this. We'll do imports, and we're going to give it a name, so import styles, and then from, and then the relative path styles.module.css. Now what I'm going to do is, instead of actually just passing in...
So basically import styles from module.css.
the class name as an actual string. We're actually going to use a pair of curly braces, and then we're going to reference styles as if it was an actual object, and then reference username as if it was a field on the object. Okay, so what really happens is this styles, this CSS module, basically takes all of your fields, and then it kind of like just puts them in an object, and you can reference it as an actual property itself, and then use that to apply the correct class to the element, okay? So I'm going to save, and let me refresh, and you'll see now, if I go to here...
Why is aqua being applied? Didn't I have a background color? Huh. Maybe something changed.
you can see I have my B element right over here, my bold element, and you can see the class name is not exactly username, but it has like this underscore username and then some auto-generated text right over here, or this hash. Okay, so it's not the exact class name, but it is applying the correct CSS styling, which is what we want. Okay, and this is what a lot of people prefer to use when it comes to styling because one, it's again locally scoped, so you don't have to really worry about your CSS conflicting with other components. Now, many of you may be familiar with a CSS preprocessor called Sass. Now, there are plenty of CSS preprocessors out there, but Sass
Yeah. Um. I am aware of. At least I've heard the name SAS, and I did search upon what it was, but at that moment in time, I didn't know much about React, and also maybe it's something related to React, perhaps. Although the way I discovered SAS was actually in a PHP application, so maybe it's used everywhere, not just specific to React. But yeah, let's just view what it is.
is one of the most popular ones, so I'll show you how to actually use it. It's actually very easy. So what we want to do is go into our project terminal. So in the directory, I'm going to go ahead and install the preprocessor. So you need to make sure you install the preprocessor before you can actually use it. So since we're using Vite, it actually supports Sass out of the box or SCSS. If you're trying to use a different preprocessor, definitely make sure you check the Vite docs first to see if it supports out of the box and see if there needs to be any special configuration. So I'm going to type npm i-d and then Sass, just like that. Okay, there we go. And then let's just run our project again. Now what I can do is create an SCSS file. So I'm just creating a file. I'll call this users.module.scss. You don't have to use CSS or and then let's just run our project again. Now what I can
What
do
is -d? What is the in npm? Yeah, npm have to. Oh, it's shortcut for save dev. Gotcha. It adds it into the dependencies part, dev dependencies part.
create an SCSS file. So I'm just creating a file. I'll call this users.module.scss. You don't have to use CSS or SCSS modules. You can just use just a regular CSS file. It depends on what you prefer. Not everyone likes to use CSS modules or SCSS modules. Some people just prefer using a regular style sheet and then importing that and then using the class name as a string literal. It's up to you. That's why I'm showing you all of these different examples. So inside my SCSS file, I'll just write regular CSS. I'm not going to go in depth on using Sass, but I'll just do, let's do this. Let's see, what else can I style? Maybe I'll style favorite foods. So foods title. And let's do font weight bold, and then font size 64 pixels, just as an example. And since I'm using a CSS module, I don't want to have hyphens in my class name. So actually, I'm going to use camel case for the class name since I'm using a CSS module. Okay. So we'll go to case for the class name since I'm using a CSS module. Okay. So we'll go to, let's go to user favorite foods. So here I want to style this text, this span element. So I'm going to first import my SCSS module. So import users, I'll just call it styles from users.module.scss. And then I'm going to go ahead and add the class name attribute. And then I'm going to provide a pair of curly braces. So class name equals curly braces. And inside styles dot and the name of the class. So foods and then title, just like that. So foods title. And then now we should see it is being applied properly. Now, if you do prefer to use a kebab case, which is what title, and then now we should see it is being applied properly. Now, if you do prefer to use a kebab case, which is what this is known as, where you have this hyphen in between each word.
Huh. That's known as kebab case. I didn't know that. I knew about Pascal case, snake case, but I mean I was aware of this type of syntax or this type of casing to be more precise, but I didn't know it was known as kebab case.
You could use
I guess it makes sense because it looks sort of like a kebab in a way, right? Like this being the individual pieces and this hyphen being kind of like the rod.
Bob case, but do note that you will need to use square bracket notation
This
to
thing.
access the class. So you would have to do something like this: styles, and then square bracket, and then foods title, just like that. Okay, it's up to you on what you prefer to do. I personally don't like using square bracket notation to access properties. Sometimes you may need to, especially if you're using kebab case. It's totally up to you. But hopefully this all makes sense. So yes, you can use Sass and any CSS preprocessor that you choose to.
All right. Okay. So we covered a bit there.
In this section of our React tutorial, I'm going to
So basically, we can either import the styles thing directly, or if you wanna do something like this where we attach the styling locally, we have to import. I mean, then what was the difference between using the normal styles.module?
teach. It's totally. Do note, do you prefer style class names span element? We'll go. So I'm going to use as an example. See what else is important. You don't set all component to use when it comes to it is name then some. You can see I save and let me refresh. And you get your
I
settings.
guess it's
So
the
for box,
same, but
after you one,
we
as
just
ambiguous
sure
cell
that we
style,
could
favorite food,
use
and font size 64 pixels,
Sass
just as
or
an
any
example.
other
And since I'm using a theme,
preprocessor.
since I'm using foods, so here I want to style this text, this span.
Now, for my own reference, what is Sass and why it is used? Sass in CSS. Let's read through this. Short for syntactically awesome style sheet. Sass is a popular CSS preprocessor. It's processed by the program and compiled into CSS code, which can be used to style HTML elements. Sass controls how it appears on the web page. Okay, variables. Yeah, variables are not not available in CSS, but it is in Sass. Imports nesting. Okay, and this at the end of the day, like when it comes to the browser, it gets converted into CSS and it makes it way to the browser. All right. All right, let's go back.
Element. So I'm going to first import my SCSS module. So import users, I'll just call it styles from users.module.scss. And then I'm going to go ahead and add the class name attribute. And then I'm going to provide a pair of curly braces. So class name equals curly braces. And inside styles dot and the name of the class. So foods and then title, just like that. So foods title. And then now we should see it is being applied properly. Now, if you do prefer to use a kebab case, which is what this is known as, where you have this hyphen in between each word, you could use kebab case, but do note that you will need to use square bracket notation to access the class. So you would have to do something like this: styles, and then square bracket, and then foods title, just like that. Okay, it's up to you on what you prefer to do. I personally don't like using square bracket notation to access properties. Sometimes you may need to, especially if you're using kebab case. It's totally up to you. But hopefully this all makes sense. So yes, you can use Sass and any CSS preprocessor that you choose to. In this section of our React tutorial, I'm going to teach you how we can take an array of elements or a list of elements. I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably. And I'm going to teach you how you can transform each element from a regular plain JSON object to a JSX element. So that way it is actually renderable to the document. It's important to understand this part because when you have an array of JSON objects, which you're going to a lot of times, especially if you're fetching data from an API, you cannot just take that plain JSON object and plug it into your JSX code and have it render to the browser. It doesn't work that way because the browser needs to be able to render something that's renderable. And a plain JSON object cannot just be rendered to the document as is. You need to take it and then transform it into a JSX element, okay? So I'm going to teach you how to do that. We're not going to be fetching data from an API, but later on you will learn how to do that, and you'll be able to apply what you're learning in this section with fetching data from an API. Now, I went ahead and actually cleaned up our code a little bit. I deleted a lot of the previous code that we wrote. In fact, I deleted everything. And I'm going to create a mock array. So I'll do that right now. So const mock users, and this will be an array. And what I'll do is inside this array, we're going to...
Oh, wait a second. Yeah, he did delete he deleted all the components and I'm gonna commit this and then we'll continue. So because I want a copy of this saved. Components, props, and styling. All right,
Go ahead and
that
just
should be
create some
applied.
plain JSON objects. So this
I guess now we can go ahead and delete all the components.
is going to represent a user, an array of users. So I'll just give it an ID of 1, and I'll give it a username, and let's just do email address. We'll keep it very simple.
Let's remove all of this. Actually, let's start from the beginning.
Okay, and then I'll do one more. So we'll have 2 users, and then we'll do username Michael, and then we'll do Michael at Michael, or for email, do Michael at Anzenta.com. So now I have 2 users, and again, pretend like this data is coming from an API. Okay, even though right now it is mock data, it is local data, but pretend it's coming from an API. Because realistically, when you fetch your data from an API, this is what it could look like. Okay, especially if you're fetching an endpoint that returns multiple elements. So if you're fetching an endpoint that gets you, let's say, 10 users at a time, then you will have an array of users. Okay, so what we're going to do is we want to render all these users to our document. Okay, because right now, if I try to just, let's say if I try to do this, if I try to do mock users like this, right? If I go to my browser, nothing's going to happen. Let me just make sure app is being rendered. It is. Okay, nothing is going to happen. You're seeing I'm trying to evaluate this array, and the browser is just clearly not showing anything. And you'll see
I guess it's uh, expected comma.
that right over here is going to happen.
And let's remove that. And let's remove. Okay, maybe I need to. Why isn't it reloading itself? Or maybe it's okay. Maybe that should fix it. We okay. We still okay. Let's delete this. Reload.
You're seeing I'm trying to evaluate this array, and the browser is just clearly not showing anything. And you'll see that right over here in the logs. Let me actually refresh. Okay,
Well,
so
I guess
we have a bunch of
he
errors
did
and saying that
not
objects are not
delete
valid
it.
as a React child. Okay, and
We
that
can
should make sense
always
because right now
make that file come back.
we're working with an object, mock user, which is an array, which is also an object, and then inside this array we have plain JSON object as well. So we can't render this as is, and that's the reason why it was giving us all of those errors. So now in order for us to render all of these objects to the document, we need to take our mock user array, go through each element, and transform each element from a plain JSON object to a JSX element, which is something that is renderable to the browser, to the document. And the easiest way to do this is to use a prototype function on our array called array.map. So if you look over here, we have our mock users array. I can actually call this map function right over here. And some of you may be familiar with this map function already. If you are, that's great. If you're not, I'll explain briefly what exactly this function does. So basically, this map function can be called on an array, and it applies a transformation on all the elements in that array, and it returns a new array with each element transformed. Okay, so it's just better if I just show you an example instead of just saying a bunch of things. So what I'll do is I'll go into the node shell right over here, and what I'll do is I'll define an array right now. So I'll just call this numbers, and then we'll do
We already know what map is, so we'll just skip this part.
callback function, aka the transformation function. So I'll do that right now. So this is my callback function. And remember, the callback function takes up to 3 arguments. The first argument is going to be the current element that we are trying to process. So in this case, I'm going to call it user because it represents the user object itself. So inside this callback function, right over here, I can reference user and all of its properties. So I can reference ID, email, username, any field I want. Okay, and you can see IntelliSense was picking up those fields. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that I am returning a value. You always want to make sure that you are returning a value, because if you don't return an explicit value, by default, array.map will just return an undefined value. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to return JSX. Okay, because whatever you return is basically what is going to be returned into that new array. So we want to return JSX. So what I want to do here is I want to basically have something that is a valid JSX, and that could be a component, it could be HTML, anything. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just return a div just to keep things simple. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each field in the user object, and I'm going to output it to the DOM by evaluating each field. So for example, let me do this. I'm going to go ahead and use a bool tag, and I'm going to render the username like this. So I'm going to reference user.username. Okay,
And
I'm
will
going to
he
use
join it all together at the end, or I guess we'll have to see. Name.
a break tag so I can go on the next line, and I'll do the same thing for email. And I'm going to do user email just like that. Okay, and I'll actually do one more for the ID. So I'll do that before the username. So ID, and then span user.id, just like this. Oh, let me also make sure I have the break tag as well. Whoops. Okay, let me also do the same thing for down here. Okay, right now we have a bunch of red squiggly lines, a bunch of linting issues. I'll address this in just a bit. Don't worry about it for now. But I want to show you what happens if I go to the document, and you'll see now, if I refresh, you can see that we are now this.
And we save it and we open it up. Um, hmm. Well, I don't get anything.
Now, but I want to show you what happens if I go to the document, and you'll see now, if I refresh, you can see that we are now this.
Or maybe I have to hard refresh. Nope, that didn't do anything. Expected. Wait, expected. So this is closed by this. This is closed by this. This is closed by this. Unexpected token. This is unexpected.
Display. But I want to show you what happens if I.
Let's see. Let's do this in a new line. Run this. And then we have this. I guess we don't need a semicolon there. Does that work? That didn't work either. So we have a bracket here. Then we have our curly brace, another bracket, another curly brace, and then we close the master div tag. That doesn't work. Maybe let's just to make sure everything is the same. Let's restore global.css. Then let's refresh. I guess that's because okay, the text was being rendered, but since it was white, we weren't able to see it. Okay.
Go to the document, and you'll see now, if I refresh, you can see that we are now displaying all of that data in the document. Okay, so just to kind of like recap what's happening, we're basically transforming each JSON object that is a user to a JSX element, because we're returning basically this JSX element that is renderable, okay, and it's just a plain div right over here. And remember that we can render divs to the document itself, okay? So what happens is we are transforming this mock users array of objects to an array of JSX elements. And in fact, if I actually did this, let me do this. If I were to console log this whole thing right over here, and if I go to the browser tools, and if I were to expand this, you'll see that the elements are now an array of React. Let me do this. If I were to console log this whole thing right over here, and if I go to the browser tools, and if I were to expand this, you'll see that the elements are now an array of React elements. You can see the type of is the symbol, React.element, okay? So it's no longer a plain JSON object. It's an actual React element, okay? And React will take care of going through each element inside this array and taking that JSX element and rendering it to the document. So it takes care of that part for you. You just need to make sure that it is an element that is renderable, okay? So hopefully this makes sense. So let me go ahead and just copy this and remove this console log. I want to go back to addressing this issue where we have this linting issue right over here. So it's telling us that we're missing a key prop for the element in iterator. And you're probably wondering, what does this even mean? Okay, so whenever you are dealing with rendering lists or arrays of elements to the document, so right over here, this is what we're doing. We're trying to render an array of users. We need to associate each element that is being rendered to the document with a unique value, okay? So in this situation right over here, you can see that we are mapping this mock users array, okay? We're taking a total of 2 users, transforming those users from a plain JSON object to a JSX element, which in the end, it gets rendered to the document, and we see 2 divs that are added to our document. If I go to the browser, if I were to go to elements, and let me just kind of expand the tree right over here, you'll see that we have a total of 2 divs right over here. We have this div, and then we have this div right over here. We have 2 divs total, okay? And you can definitely assume that if we had, let's say, 10 users, then you'd be correct that there would be 10 extra divs, or I'm sorry, not 10 extra divs, 10 divs total added to the document, all of which represent a user element. Now, we need to make sure that each one of these divs, and it's not just a div, whatever your root element is, so for example, if this was a section, if this was a nav, if this was any HTML element, or even a component, which I'll show you how to do that in the next part, you need to make sure that this element has a unique key. The reason why this is important is because React needs to use these keys to keep track of how these elements are being appended to the document as well as being removed from the document.
But what is weird is that it's not throwing that error out here for me. Either something's happened in the last 8 months or something, it might be something related to my VS Code configuration.
Now, if your application is very simple, you might not really notice much of a difference, or you might not even notice the issue right away or at all. But down the road, as your application gets more complex, you're going to run into weird bugs where, let's say, for example, if you try to remove an element and then add the same element back again, you're going to see that the order is going to look very weird, okay? So that's just one example of a potential problem that you might run into. There are a lot of other issues too that could happen, so it's very important that you have an associated key with your elements. It's very easy to do that. What you do is you just use this key prop right over here, or this attribute. We're going to call it an attribute because we're just using a regular div. So you're going to pass in this key, and then you want to make sure you pass in an actual unique value, okay? So what you want to do is look at your resource, and you want to ask yourself, okay, what field can I use that is actually guaranteed to be unique? So, for example, I have this ID field, and majority of the time, you can always make the assumption that this ID is guaranteed to be unique, especially if you're using a database. And your database is auto-incrementing your unique IDs. So it goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on and so forth. You can assume that this ID will always be unique, okay? There might be some situations where you might not have a unique key or a unique ID that you can use. And in those situations, you might want to generate some kind of hash. We're not going to talk about that in this section, okay? But for now, we'll keep things simple. And we know that this ID is going to be unique. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in user ID as a value for this key attribute. And now you'll see that this error goes away, or this warning goes away. And if I go back to the browser, all of my errors are gone, or all of my warnings are gone, okay? And visually, you're not going to notice any difference at all. And even if you inspect your browser tools, if you go into the tree, what I'll do is inside the browser tools, right over here, I'm going to go to this div, and then I'm going to highlight it. And if I go to properties, you're going to see that right over here, that this React Fiber property over here, you'll see that it has this key, and the value of it is 1. If I go to the next div, right over here, this one, okay, same user element, And if I were to look at the properties, you'll see that the key is 2. Okay. If I were to add more users, so let me do this real quick. I'll just
What's the usual value then? What if I don't provide a key? What's the usual? Okay, it's null. So yeah, let's just add that back in there.
add 2 more users. I'll change the ID to 3 and 4 respectively. You'll see that the other divs right over here will have a key of 3, and then this one will have a key of 4. Okay, and underneath the hood, React will use these keys to keep track of each element. Again, there's a lot of reasons why you need keys. We'll probably dive into this topic in a separate video, but just again, remember that you always need to make sure you are assigning keys that are unique whenever you're rendering lists of elements. Okay,
Alright,
and just to
got
show you
it.
what happens if I were to have, let's say, 2 elements with the same ID, you're going to see that React is actually going to complain. It's going to say encounter 2 children with the same key 4, and it says keys should be unique so that components maintain their identity across updates. And this should make sense because, again, when you're trying to add or remove elements, React needs to know which element that needs to remove or add. And having the same key is going to create conflict. Okay, so now instead of actually just returning a div and then having all of this JSX inside this div over here, we're actually going to move all of this code into its own components. Okay, and this will teach you the basics of reusability. While this does work, we want to make sure that we're keeping our code more organized and clean and more readable. Okay, and the purpose of this is because, for example, yes, this does work. We're rendering all the data to the document, but we always want to make sure that we are creating components that represent the resource that we are trying to render to the document. Okay, so what we'll do is instead of rendering or instead of just returning this div, I'm actually just going to return this user details component, which we're going to build out. So let me do this. I'm going to just copy this right over here, and I'll delete this div over here. And what I'll do is I'll go into the user details component, and instead of returning this fragment, I'm going to return a div, and let me paste all of this code that I just copied from right over here. So it's going to look pretty much the same thing as what we had before. The only difference is that it's encapsulated in its own component, in its own user details component. Okay. Now, let's
rename this. Okay, let's export the function. Let's name it the same as the file name. Let's wrap this inside the div.
What's important is that inside this user details component, you can see that we need a reference to the user's ID, the user's username, as well as the user's email. So this should spark the idea that we want to make sure that we are passing those fields as props to the user details component. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to return user details just like this.
How we import? Yeah, we are importing it.
Okay, so return user details with the angle brackets. And we need to make sure that we're still passing in a key. So let's pass in that key, and we're going to use user.id. And let me just fix this real quick. Let me just change this from ID 4 to 3. And now we need to also make sure, oh, whoops, I need to import the component up top over here. Let's do that. Import user details from the user details file. Okay, so let's also make sure that we're passing in the necessary props. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in this user argument that we're getting from the callback function that we passed to the map function. Remember, this user argument is the user itself in this mock users element. We're going to take that user and we're just going to pass it as a prop to user details. Okay, so we're passing the user object into the user details component. So let's do that. So user, we're going to call the prop user, and we're just going to pass in user just like that. Okay, so we're passing an object to user details.
And then
now we're going to go into the user details component, and we need to take in the props as an argument. So we're going to add props as an argument to this function right over here.
We can define it
and
as
props
a
is an object that's going to have this user prop as a field. So if I were to console log props like this, you'll see that when I refresh, you'll see that right over here on line 2, which is where we're logging the props over here, it has this user field, and that user field is an object with all of its fields. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I can do a lot of things. I can either just reference props directly and then just reference user.id for everything, and this would work just fine. And you'll see that everything is going to be rendered to the document just fine. We're getting these linting issues because we haven't done prop validation, but this works just fine. Or the other thing that you could do, and I recommend doing this, is actually just destructure the prop itself in the argument signature.
Okay.
So what I can do, instead of just doing props.user for everything, I could actually just destructure it like this. So I'm basically unpacking the user field from the props object in the function's argument signature right over here. Okay. And then what I can do is I can reference user directly like this, instead of having to reference props.user, and then it works the same exact way. Okay.
I see. Or I guess another way is to define a variable, but I see how destructuring would be more syntax friendlier. It would be less code.
Now let's go ahead and just very quickly add the prop validation, might as well. So now you can see that we're pretty much taking everything that we've learned from the previous sections and we're putting everything together. So let's add prop validation. So we'll do user details.
Well, first of all, let's see if everything is still working. We haven't broken anything, and it is. So
Dot prop type. Remember this P right over here is a lowercase. And then we need to validate the prop itself, which is user. Remember, we're only passing in one prop to the user details component. We're not passing in each element or each field in the user object individually. You could if you wanted to. I think it's just easier just to pass the entire object as a whole. Okay, so we'll reference user just
what's that?
prop to the user details component. We're not passing in each element or each field in the user object individually. You could if you wanted to. I think it's just easier just to pass the entire object as a whole. Okay, so we'll reference user just like that, and then we're going to reference prop types, and then we're going to use the shape function to validate the shape of this user object. So this is how you can actually validate objects. Okay, so we need to make sure we validate the ID. So ID is going to be a number. So we'll do prop types dot number is required. Username needs to be validated. So we'll do prop types. Username is a string, and then is required. And we'll do the same thing for email. So email prop types dot string is required. Okay, and now you can see that the linting errors go away. If I refresh, no errors in the console, no warnings in the console. And if I were to remove email from one of these objects, you'll see that it's going to go ahead and give us a warning because one of our objects in the mock user array did not have an email field defined. Okay, that's the reason why it's giving us this failed prop type warning. So hopefully this makes sense. So now you can see that this is a lot more cleaner than what we had originally. You're encapsulating everything in a single component. And what's nice is that, let's say, for example, you might not necessarily render an array of JSX elements to the document, but you might want to render an individual user to the document itself. And having this user details component allows you to reuse this component because all you need to do is just get the user an
Let's see. Okay, everything is still working.
individual
Nothing is
user. You can
broken.
fetch that from your API, right? Assuming that you have an endpoint that retrieves a single user, you can pass in the user object and then render all of these details to the page or to the document itself. Okay, so this allows you to reuse this component over and over and over again. So you save a lot of time from just manually rendering a div and writing out all these tags and rendering each field. So hopefully this makes sense. Okay, and other things that I would mention too is that this enables you to properly encapsulate state, especially when you need state for your components. We haven't talked about state just yet, but we will get to that later on in this tutorial, but it's just something to consider. In this section of our React tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to.
All right, people. We covered a lot today, and I'm ending the stream now. And yeah, so far React looks, amazing. Like, yeah, I can see why it is popular. Although I have also seen, people hate on React quite a lot. Hence the need for other frameworks, but I don't know what exactly the reason for that would be unless I create projects and learn more about it. So, yeah. Anyway, let me. I'll be ending the stream now. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.